My name is Jack McMichael. I'm an architect with End User Computing. For those who haven't met me, don't know me, I've been at VMware for several years, and I actually started in our global support organization supporting View on the very first View team. And then from there I went into R&D and did some development work for the product, actually did some features there. And now I'm an architect and talk to a lot of customers about their environments and help a lot of folks in the field with troubleshooting. And so I like to do this session and try to give you guys a good base of knowledge for troubleshooting View. Who, quick show of hands, who's new to the product? Who really is kind of a new admin? Great, quite a few of you. That's what's amazing. I've been doing this session now for about a year and a half, and of course the product's been around for much longer than that, but it's amazing that as many times we do this, there's still many new people coming to it. It's sometimes hard for me to remember because this is old hat for me, but I'm glad you all made it. I know it's the end of the week and you guys are probably ready to go home, but let's dive in. So, general disclaimer, obviously, we're not going to be talking really about any new stuff that's coming in this session. This is mostly going to be talking about existing things, but our general disclaimer here. So the general agenda is we're gonna talk about some common issues up front, and then we're going to dive into the various areas that you need to identify in terms of when you're troubleshooting View, the main kind of components to where a problem may lie. So we'll break that down. And just a quick reminder, I will make these slides available, like many of the sessions here at VMworld. So if we want to take pictures, feel free, but these will be available as a PDF, I believe is how they distribute it. So you can get all this because there will be some scripts and some things like that are a little bit tough to read in a picture, so you can grab all those later. So talking about some common issues, one of the things that we like to do every year is talk to our GSS guys, global support guys, and say, hey, what are the problems that people are calling about? If you've been to this session before or maybe seen me talk about this before, you'll notice something key about the slide. It hasn't changed. It's the same exact slide from last year. And there's a reason for that. The issues are pretty much the same, right? There's a lot of very common things, which is why we like to have this session, because the same kind of problems are still plaguing administrators. And one of those being SSL. That still seems to be a tough one for a lot of people. When you install the product, one of the first things you notice is that we put the self-signed certificate in, so you're going to have some warnings about that. So one of the first things we can do, of course, is replace the certificates. We'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. Persona, making sure persona is configured right. There's a lot of misconception out there about persona. I hear people say, man, persona, it's just not good, or it just doesn't work, or I got to go buy something else. And my response to that is it actually is really good. It works really well. But the big difference between persona and something like, say, Profile Unity or one of the other third-party profile management systems is that it does everything. So if you just plug and play, you just install and go, it's going to do everything, which is typically a problem. You'll usually run into problems, especially as you scale, because all the data is going to be synchronized. And so the key to making persona work well is to read the documents and understand that you may not necessarily want to sync the entire profile, including app data, temp folders, things like that. So it's important to read into that if you're going to use that aspect of Horizon View. Also, big key, parent VM. If you're new to Horizon View, please do not use an image from your corporate template, standard image that you use for physical machines. It's not how we want to do things. We want to start with a clean ISO image. I promise you'll have a better time if you do that. So there's a lot of things you'll run into. Now, it's not to say you can't install the same applications as your corporate template, but you want to start fresh, because from a virtual standpoint, when you do a P2V or you use those pre-built images that we use on physical machines, there's a lot of times little pieces of software that get in the way. You don't want to have to deal with that later. It's better to start clean and build it with a VDI environment in mind. Another thing they get a lot of calls about, PC over IP, as well as connectivity. We're going to go into some of that and talk a little bit more about that. But the big thing I hope you take away from this session is log analysis. We're going to talk about analyzing logs and how important it is as part of the troubleshooting process, as well as some of the things that you can look at when you're doing it. So jumping into the certificates, please read the manual. We have some really good documentation on this aspect of setting up Horizon View. But one of the things I'll show you here in a second is some screenshot of actually using a Microsoft Certificate Authority. If anything, if you want to have regular certificates that are not the self-signed variety that will pop up errors every time you connect to your View environment, just install an MSCA. You can find plenty of videos and articles on how to do that. It's fairly easy, straightforward. So go Google for that. You get that, and then it's a process of really setting up a template and then enrolling in that template. There's also a lot of videos on how to do that. But going through that process and having at least an internal certificate is much better than using the self-signed. If you use a third-party template, or a third-party certificate, I should say, with a third-party CA, then there's some key takeaways. You want to make sure that you have your key be exportable. You want to make sure the friendly name is VDM, and you want to make sure the compatibility is set right. We need to have the Windows 2003 compatibility level. But having the DNS name, the FQDN, as your subject alternative name, as well as your common name, as well as having the IP address as your subject alternative name, anytime you're going to access that server, you want to make sure that all those are listed in the certificate. If you're using a wildcard certificate or something with an intermediary, then you want to make sure you have that entire chain, bundle it together in a PFX. There's lots of good articles on how to do this out there on the internet. So I encourage you to try to dig in and do that so that you don't have users complaining about the SSL warnings. We still get a lot of calls up. People have trouble. It's a lot easier in the newer version of View because now we do utilize the Microsoft Certificate Store, so you don't have to use the key tool. And once you get these certificates set up, adding them into Composer is fairly simple as well with the SVI config tool. The big thing is also remember that the self-signed certificate is going to have that friendly name of VDM. So when you do replace a certificate, make sure you rename the original one, or you may run into problems still. So quick screenshot from if you have created a Microsoft Certificate Authority, you want to make sure you have some of that information over here, your DNS names. Notice we have localhost in here as well. If you tend to access the View administrator from your actual broker machine, stick it in there, because then it won't give you an error when you're accessing it locally as well. Just kind of a nice thing to do. But you'll definitely want to have the IP address. Also keep in mind if you're doing this for a security server, if you have a VIP, right? If you have a VIP instead of an internal IP, things like that might get you still having warnings if you have the wrong IP address that doesn't match up with the way you're accessing it. But using the Microsoft Certificate Authority, it's very easy to enroll in these certificates and add them to the store. One of the things I plan on doing, we had an internal conference here last week, and I did a walkthrough kind of all through this entire process. So I'm going to take that and give that to our global support guys. Hopefully one of those guys can create a KB article that just really goes through it, step by step with pictures. Because, like I said, you wouldn't believe how many people still have trouble with this, but it's a fairly easy process. Once you've kind of seen it done once and gone through it, then you can have that nice, SSL certificate of, non-warning when your users connect. It's amazing how much this is still a problem, but, we live in the world of SSL these days, so it's important to make sure that it's set up correctly and, or set up at all. So, some of the troubleshooting keys. We provide a lot of utilities for you to be able to troubleshoot within View, but a good place to start is the dashboard, making sure that you check the status of things within the environment. Now with the latest version of View, we show things like the status of the RDS farm, right, as well as cloud pod architecture. If you have multiple pods joined, you can see all those things and the health, the status of things currently right on the dashboard. It updates constantly. Also domain health. Of course, we're checking to make sure we can contact the domain controllers. Always important. Make sure you set up a event log or event database for the actual event viewer. There's a lot of people that will skip that step when they install and say, we'll get to it later. But I'm telling you, there's a lot of information that's good in there, and it complements the logs very well. And there's some good utilities for using that data. So it's a step that I see a lot of people skipping. They just say, we'll just do that later. And then something bad happens, and well, we don't have that data to go look at. So you guys have freshly deployed View. What could go wrong? Well, there's a number of areas that we're going to dive into. From a broker perspective, you could have some broker problems. Connectivity is typically a big problem, right? In a VDI environment, we're very dependent on connectivity. So making sure that all your ports are open in the right places, we don't have firewalls that have gotten turned on or turned off. It's very important. Having performance issues, resource problems in terms of your hosts, your desktops. It's important to make sure you're monitoring correctly. Also, making sure that when you see an error in view, knowing what that means. We'll talk about a few of them and some of the things that you can look for in a log, but there's basically 4 main domains that we're going to talk about today in terms of where things could go wrong. But before we do that, it's important to also understand the architecture of a Horizon View environment. Of course, now we're adding things like RDS hosts for apps, for desktops. There's new components that are coming into the fold. It's not just the client, the agent, the broker anymore. Of course, we have our vCenter server. It's always been there. We have Composer. Lots of things that, as we continue to expand VDI and make it not just about desktops, but about apps, there's a lot more things to consider. So make sure you understand, even ThinApp, right? We still have a lot of folks who love ThinApp. And if that's part of the environment, it's important to understand all the components that can really make up your virtual desktop environment. So diving into the first domain, client connectivity issues. Clearly, if we can't connect with our client, we're not going to have a good experience. The users are not going to be able to get their desktop. The desktop may be performing badly. So it's critical to make sure that client connectivity is always up and running well. So, some of the things you can see, black screen, that was a common issue when VDI first came around, especially when PC over IP first came around. So, some of you who aren't new to this, I'm sure can remember the black screen of death, as we like to call it. But that, we don't see it as much anymore, but it's still there, right? If you don't have connectivity, that can happen. So when we do fail to communicate, how do we look at that? How do we really understand, where the failure is? So looking at the connection broker logs is your first and best option. We log a lot of information from a user perspective. It's almost too much, right? We put a lot of information in these logs, and so one of the things we'll talk about here in a minute is how to really break that down. But looking in the logs and looking in the event database is going to be your best source to see a session track all the way through from end to end. We can see it on the broker, we can see it on the client, and we can see it on the agent. One of the things I like to suggest as a little tip, change the directory where you store your logs. By default, I need to update this slide. This is actually not correct. It's program data /VMware /VDM /logs. Application data is not actually part of that path. But by default, we kind of bury the logs, right? And this is on all the components. They're kind of hidden down. Program data is not visible by default. So I encourage you to change the policy. We have a lot of policies that we include with Horizon View from a broker perspective, from a client perspective, all of them, right? All the components have group policy objects, and one of the things that you can do is configure the log location. I put it in C:/logs. Makes sense to me, right? Good place to look. That way, when you're trying to collect them or trying to dive into the problem, you get a call and something's going on, you don't have to go hunting around for them. So easy thing that you can do. But some of the things that you can look for in that log are like the win-off filter. Anytime we're seeing authentication, right? When we have a session come in, we're going to authenticate to the broker. The broker is then going to talk to the domain controller, make sure that we're a valid user. It's also going to check the entitlements, and pass that back to the client. And then we're going to make a connection to the desktop where our credentials are automatically given by the broker for SSO, and away we go. But there's a lot of things that we can see as part of this process in the logs, like the authorization filter or the AJP service. When we first come in and we first hit that web service, we can see this whole process end to end. And likewise, we have a lot of audits that happen to report when a user logs in, when a failure occurs, of course, from a login. And then when we have a success or failure on any major aspect of this, we also have an event that's generated, hence broker user logged in. So there's a number of places, and we're going to see these events not only in the events database, but as well as in the logs. So from end to end, a very clear picture will start emerging when you understand how to look at this information in the logs. One of the things you'll always want to key on is the session ID over here. And in the latest versions, we obfuscate the middle portion just for security reasons, but you can still take that identifier and you can look through the logs to understand end to end what happened during a session. When we're trying to track sessions, it's important to filter out the white noise. As I said, we have a lot of information. I've had customers send me log bundles from brokers that were 20 gigs large because they keep a lot of them and they fill up to the max every hour, sometimes rolling every so many minutes, depending on how large your environment is. But we keep more than just logs when we collect a diagnostic bundle. We look at things like what software is installed, registry entries, processes that are running. There's a lot of information that's gathered, but as part of the actual logs themselves, there's a lot of white noise. One of the things about Horizon View is that we're a real-time management aspect from a broker perspective. So when people are logging in or connecting in, we keep track of that in memory, real time. It's not stored in a database somewhere. It all happens in memory. But because of that, in a cluster topology, we have to replicate that information to all the other brokers and make sure that everybody knows what's happening in real time as it happens. Because of that, the best place for us to keep track of that information is in the log. So you'll see lots of entries about the current state of things because we need to make sure that we have a record so when things go wrong, we understand what was going on in memory since we can't go look in the LDAP to get that information. One of the tools that I like to promote is using Beartail or Bear Grab. Now this is a third-party tool, costs like $30. You can use any tool really. This is just the one that I use because it has nice pretty colors and that makes it easier for me to read. And what I have here is a little demo that I want to show you, a little video I made. Oop, that's not the right way. Hopefully it will play for us today. Hey, look at that. So this is a little video I put together with Camtasia just to kind of give you an idea of what it looks like to track a session end to end. So you're going to see me open up a log file, a live log file from a broker. We're going to pull it up. I put a little caption there in case you just want to watch that instead of watch me. But we're going to actually pull up this log and start filtering real time on this log as things are happening. One of the things I'm going to do is actually add a highlight to my name. So you're going to see me add a highlight for Jack. One of the things to note about tracking sessions is that you'll actually have not every bit of information in every line. So for example, if we're tracking a session for myself, every line for that session may not have the session in it, and likewise, every line for my session may not have my name in it. So a good thing to do is if I know that I'm looking for Jack, I can put in a highlight for Jack, and then I can find the session ID, and then I can add another highlight for the session so that I can see every log line that pertains to myself or my session. And that will give me a clear picture of what's going on. So you can see I've logged in, I actually made a connection, and you're seeing the live log scroll by. And look how much white noise is in there. I mean, 90% of the log, it has nothing to do with my session. But at the bottom, I'm getting that nice filter view of every line that I want. So I add another filter here for that session. I grab the session ID. I grab it. I just remove what I don't need. I grab just that session ID, and I add another highlight for that. This is what I do when customer calls or I get an escalation comes in, and they say, hey, let's take a look. If we need to track a session, this is how I would do it. And keep in mind, these tools can open a live log as it's being written to, so we can just really watch these sessions as they're coming through. Gives you a really good idea of what's happening, especially on the bottom half of the pane, because now I can see very clearly, is it an error? What are we running into at the end of the day? So here I've added and changed so we can see both of those. Now we have lines at the bottom that pertain to both those filters. And as you can see, they're mixed in here. And so you get the whole picture of the session. This is a real fundamental troubleshooting step that a lot of people overlook. So if you take away anything from today, take away this. And know that there are free tools out there. I think Microsoft distributes one as part of, it's a toolkit for SCCM or something. They have their own little grep tail utility that you can get completely free. This is just one I like, but they're out there. You could even use Linux. If you have Linux, you can do that. You can load those files in there and do, a grep or a tail or whatever is the easiest for you. But the bottom line is that using these types of tools to make sure that you filter out the white noise and get the relevant parts of the log, that's going to be critical to troubleshooting View. I can't emphasize it enough. So moving on to user experience issues, touched on the black screen of death. We don't see that as much anymore, fortunately. Most people have figured out now that you got to have ports open for View. It's just really part of the deal if you want to be using VDI. But having port 4172 blocked, that's going to cause it every single time. A lot of times customers will have a group policy or something's gone awry with group policy to disable the firewall on the desktop. And so all of a sudden it gets flipped back on. Users are getting black screens. They call support. Hey, is your firewall on? Well, it shouldn't be. Well, it is, and that's why that's happening. But there's a lot of other things we can look at in the logs, especially the PC over IP logs. So, I think we have another slide that talks about some of the specific errors that you'll look for. But another common thing that happens is having the incorrect PC over IP external URL. When you're configuring your broker in the View Administrator, keep in mind that the IP, you'll have your main broker URL at the top, and then you'll have the IP address for PCRIP and BLAST at the bottom. If you use VIPs, you need to make sure that's the right IP address. Whichever address that people are going to actually put in their browser or put into the client and hit, that's the one that you want to have in there, not the internal one that you may use. If you don't have the right one, then it's going to have a mismatch, and things aren't going to work. So that can be a common one on when you first set things up and things aren't working out too good. So, as I said, looking into the actual PC over IP logs, some of the things you can look for if you are having performance problems, look for loss equals. We have a threshold, I would say, typically 0.1%. Right here in this entry, you see 0.45, 0.21. For receive and transmit. This is an easy line that you can just look for, loss equals, and search for that. And you'll usually see 0.00/0.00 over and over and over again. But if you are seeing some loss, you might have a problem. Here's the gotcha. Loss in PC over IP is not the same as loss on the network, and that's a common misconception. You need to understand that from a PC over IP perspective, we expect packets to be in order, one after another. If those packets get out of order for any reason, maybe a WAN accelerator, anything that could be on your network that could be touching those packets when they flow through, they could get those packets out of order. So you have performance problems. Users are calling saying, it's not working, or things are just, keeps dropping, sessions are dropping. You call the network guy, he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I see 0 packet loss everywhere across the board. It's not a network problem. Well, it is a network problem because they're getting out of order from something. And when that happens, PC over IP says, out order, dropping it. Don't want it, it has to be in order. Don't want to have anything to do with it if it's out of order. So this is where you'll see these kinds of things, right? Having loss. This is another good way to dive into logs and understand when there really is a problem, even though the network guy says there's no, because there really isn't on his side, right? There are no drop packets, so important to know these kinds of things. Also, if you get randomly disconnected sessions, you might have some issues going on with Composer where you have maybe an error has happened, and so we're not re-provisioning anymore, or maybe we have VMs that are getting stuck. When people are trying to log off or disconnect, the agent's getting hung for some reason, maybe antivirus or some other piece of software is in there. We get this pending expired state where essentially their previous VM, it's pending a connection. We try to reconnect and it's pending, and then it just waits and waits and waits. And so in the meantime, the user drops and tries to get back in, but it still thinks that we're trying to connect. And so you get these funny things that can happen when you have crashes, as well as connectivity issues with JMS. Now, if you don't know what JMS is, it's the Java Messaging Service, and this is the protocol that we use for that real-time communication amongst brokers. That's how we keep track of everything real-time, and so it's very critical that that protocol on port 4001 is running all the time and not blocked in any way. Not only between the brokers, but also between the brokers and the agents, right? Because as soon as we connect, the agent reports back to the broker, says, we're good here, we're connected, so just letting you know. And then that gets replicated amongst the group. So all these connectivity issues really can contribute to the state of things and your user experience. So the next domain, talking about a desktop not available. This is also pretty common. If like we were talking about with pending expired, if things happen from a communication standpoint, you'll have users who can't, it's not that they are having a problem, they just can't flat out get in. It's just not happening. So there's a number of things that we can look for, and a number of places to look. Of course, again, the logs and the event database. We are going to log events for this. A lot of times what's going to be happening, well, actually, let me go back. Nope. Don't fail me now, PowerPoint. So you can see an example of one of the of status information that we have. Here at the bottom, you see this line, and we're talking about the pool allocating, it's looking for a session, right? We're looking for a session over here for a user when they come in, but you can see that we returned 2 guests. So maybe it thinks we're already logged in some places, right? This is yet another example of all this status information, all that white noise that we put. It may look like white noise, but if you know what you're looking for, there's a lot of valuable information in there. So just to reiterate some of the ports, just to give you a nice outline, here's a good one for a picture. Keep in mind that port requirements are changing, right? We have a lot of new things that are being added with BLAST, with multimedia redirection. We've had some incarnations of that, as well as some of the new stuff like cloud pod architecture. There's this new global entitlement layer up there. So we have more LDAP that needs to run on 22389, as well as the channel between the brokers, between the pods on 8472. It's always important to keep track of, when you're a View administrator, new stuff as it comes out, because if you want to utilize these features, you're going to need to have these ports opened. I have this old graphic up here just to kind of give you the classic view of those connections, and just to emphasize that we're always changing, right? This graphic is only like a year and a half old, and we have all these new ports now that are still coming into the mix. So just always keep in mind, we have a lot of this documented on kb.vmware.com. So we keep a lot of those, well, at least we try to keep them very up to date, with all the port requirements for all of our products. And so always keep in mind to, check it when things are failing or desktops are not available. Make sure that all your ports are up, listening, things are good internally. So other messages that you can look for when desktops are not available. When you actually request a desktop, when the broker is requesting over here, you see this message in the event database. You can see a total session count here, right? We're allocating a session, a new session for this particular farm implementation, which is essentially a pool, right? Another machine allocated event. When you start reading through the logs and kind of getting, a sense of a lot of these keywords, you can really enhance your troubleshooting, speed, right? Because you kind of start to see a pattern emerge where essentially we have sessions coming in, we have, sessions disconnecting or reconnecting, and then outside of that, it's just a lot of status information, a lot of dumps of status information. Who's connected where, how many sessions a desktop has, how many sessions a broker has seen, a lot of status, because again, we keep that in memory, so it's important for us to dump it down every now and then to a file so that if things just go really, really bad, we at least know where the status of things was when it died. You can see a broker attempting SSO. If a user will not be logged on typically. If you don't see SSO being attempted, then you're just going to see the Control-Alt-Delete screen, which is completely valid. Some people actually configure things that way. But keep in mind that if you don't see SSO being performed, then they're not going to have SSO flowing through. And that's another thing. If they're connecting and just seeing Control-Alt-Delete, then there's a problem with SSO. Something is interfering there. Maybe the GINA chain is broken on the actual VM. Some of you who are familiar with that, we insert ourselves into the Windows Gina chain, so we're part of that logon process. It's important for that component to be there. If it's not properly chained, it's not going to work. So sometimes there's other applications that use the Gina chain, like an Improvada or something like that, right, that may also want to perform SSO. So it's important that we install the view agent, of course, at the very end, because we want to be the last person in the Gina chain. So if you need to actually check who a desktop is allocated to, maybe it should be available. There's a lot of information that we keep in the LDAP, and it's very easy to go look at. It's a little harder to go change, but it's very easy to go look at. And I'll give you some queries coming up here on another slide to actually go do that if you've never done it before. But this slide is just to emphasize that there's a lot of information you can actually see, and in this particular example, you can see this particular VM you can see a lot of the attributes to it, like its distinguished name, where it was actually created from, but also, what's its host name, things like that. And as you go through these attributes, you'll see things like who it's assigned to, right? What user is actually assigned to this VM. Some other key attributes you might want to look for: display name, that's your typical FQDN, the path where we think it lives in Virtual Center. That's very important. We don't have a bi-directional communication with Virtual Center. We tell it where to put things, and then we kind of go about our business. If you go into Virtual Center, I'm sure many of you might have found this out the hard way, and move things around, maybe say create a folder and move a whole pool into a folder, the path has changed. Virtual Center doesn't let us know. It doesn't tell us that. So we go looking for that VM. That's not where we think it is. And so now it's considered missing. So if you need to verify what the path that we think where it should be versus where you actually have it, this is a good attribute to go look at. Of course, the state, whether it's connected, disconnected, unavailable, available, various states that we can be in. All this information is right there in that static attribute that we update quite frequently, but it is saved there in the LDAP, unlike some of the stuff we keep in memory. Maybe what snapshot it is, right? Sometimes in pools, we like to stage things and have one snapshot or many snapshots in use by the same pool. So that's a good attribute if you're trying to figure out who might be using a wrong or bad snapshot. So just some other quick lines you can look at. This is kind of more for your reference. Agent pending, if you have a VM that maybe gets stuck in an agent pending, it just, for some reason, maybe the agent died, or something's happening on the virtual machine so that you try to connect and it thinks you're connecting, but then it just kind of stalls out and dies. You get into this state, and so you'll see these things in the log. So this is, again, for your reference, for you to come back and read later, and these are the types of messages you can start looking at in the logs when you're looking to find out why a VM is not available. We talked about the events database. If you're savvy with SQL, hop in there. There's some really great queries that you can run, and a lot of good information that's extracted from here. If you're not so good with SQL or have never touched it before, there's also a great tool that we have on our Fling site called the Horizon View Event Notifier. It will actually monitor this database. One of our colleagues, Chris Halstead, created this great tool. We have a lot of great tools on our Fling sites. If you're not familiar with them, it's labs.vmware.com/flings. Highly encourage you to go check that. We have lots of great tools out there, and this is one of them, because you can actually put in different events that you want to be notified about and configure the email component, and it'll send you a little note, let you know, hey, this happened. Maybe you want to know when Virtual Center goes down if you've been having trouble with that aspect. So good tool to use as a part of your tool chest. And then finally, in this aspect, always check your dashboard. There's, it's always going to be your first, source. Big thing is DNS and Active Directory. We really rely on DNS and Active Directory to be running all the time and running well. Obviously with Windows desktops, it's an important component. So, if things are going wrong with logins, make sure that we can get to the broker, to the domain controller correctly. You'll see that in the dashboard, but if you have a lot of domain controllers, it could be that we're trying to go to one that maybe we're not testing. So it's always good to go look at that. Also, already used. This is something we don't see as much these days, but it still is out there. If you're running View 5.2, 5.1, some of the older 5 series, that you get into this weird state where maybe you have a pool that actually recomposes on log off. But for some reason, the agent crashes. You can get into what's called a dirty state, where the VM's actually been used before, but it hasn't been recycled. And so therefore, it's not available for general use because we don't want to do that. So we have some ways of dealing with that, but that's another kind of weird state that sometimes if you run into, or if you see in the view administrator in your list of VMs already used popping up, that's why. That's why, because that VM did not have a clean exit, and so it's not considered available. It's already been used and it's dirty. So you can either delete it. There's a number of things you can do to handle that. But if you see that and you've never seen it before, that's what's going on there. And again, with Active Directory, when we create linked clones, you'll see in the composer log for the access denied trying to domain join, right? That's something we do constantly with linked clones. We're trying to create computer objects, join to the domain. So if you can't access the domain, or perhaps, in older versions, we could not reuse computer accounts. In the newer ones, we can, but that could be an issue there. So things to keep in mind when you're running into problems creating linked clones. All right, so the next section, we're going to talk about the broker a little bit more. And when things go wrong on the broker now, especially if you're new to View, this might be an area of interest because if you're setting up a POC or really just kind of getting your feet wet, things can go wrong. You can create things, or maybe you do something you shouldn't have done in Virtual Center, delete a VM, maybe that you shouldn't have. Things can happen, right? Problems happen, but we don't have to panic. We don't have to start over. I've had a lot of customers, especially when I was in global support, that would call and be like, you know what, forget it. Forget it, I'm just deleting the whole thing and starting over. Well, look, you can do that, or you could try to do a couple queries to clean things up, and let's just move about our business. Let's not waste half a day uninstalling everything and reinstalling everything. So we're going to look at a few things here to help you along with that. One of the things that you can do is if a broker is having trouble, we get into some sort of split brain scenario where our network has been segmented. We can check the replication topology. Just like Active Directory, our brokers use LDAP. And just like Active Directory, we do a pretty good job of trying to deal with any sort of collisions. But sometimes things happen, right? Sometimes our network gets segmented. Sometimes we have a big outage. And when that happens, we can use this built-in utility, same thing we would use for a domain controller, to actually check that topology. Now, in this particular example, I don't have any other replicating partners in this cluster. But just to give you an idea, this is the exact command line you would run. And in the case that you did have a cluster, you would see the list of all the partners of that cluster and the current status of what they're replicating. So good utility to check to see if maybe we have some sort of problem with the replication. Also, from a sizing perspective, I always recommend to size right and size it right first, right? If you do have a very small broker, maybe for a POC, or you're just kind of doing it in the lab, just kind of giving it a whirl, trying things out, make sure that you resize it later. But we like to say just size it right from the beginning so you don't have to have downtime, because a lot of times what happens is we create a POC or we create a lab environment and that becomes production, right? A lot of us have seen that before. So sizing it correctly is key. Now, with older versions of View, we had this fun little problem of the Java heap. That was a big issue. You size it wrong at the beginning or size it small, the Java heap was small, and then it was kind of a pain in the butt to come back and readjust that. Fortunately, for those who don't know, good news, we do that dynamically now. So if you change the memory on the broker, reboot the broker, the heap is automatically resized. So fixes a lot of problems there. Keep in mind that the actual requirements that we have for a broker from a sizing perspective are the minimum. So 2 CPU, 10 gigs of RAM for any environment over 50 VMs, that's the minimum. I commonly see customers that are running 24 gigs of memory, 4 vCPUs. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that you all need to run out and resize your brokers to have 24 gigs of memory. What I'm saying is that your mileage may vary. So understand that 10 gigs of RAM and 2 vCPUs is the minimum that we recommend for an enterprise environment. And if you are seeing some performance problems or sluggish issues with your brokers, it's not a bad idea to give it 16 gigs, 20 gigs, whatever you can spare, and possibly a few more vCPUs. So don't be discouraged from making above the minimum, resource allocations to your brokers. Knowing that, obviously if you have a full 7-broker cluster, I mean, that's a lot of memory to devote to a VDI environment, but it's still something to consider because, having to take down a broker later in order to adjust those resources can be not always very fun if you're in production, right? Okay, well, there we go. vCenter, let's talk about vCenter. Obviously with VDI, we're very dependent on vCenter. We use it constantly, right? We're creating full clones, link clones, whether it's template, whether it's, whatever it may be, we're registered machines. vCenter can go down, right? It's not always perfect. Things happen. It can get very busy if we're in a very large environment. We send, we have a threshold for commands that we send out. Sometimes that, can get very busy. Sometimes that link can seem to be down. Now, we've addressed this in, I think it was 5.1 or 5.2. We started implementing a cache, right? Now, this isn't just a ginormous cache that we keep of everything, but rather it's just a small cache to keep the number of operations that we're hammering on vCenter to a minimum. So for some things like inventory, things like that, we can get very quickly and not have to constantly berate Virtual Center. But even that gets stale sometimes, and sometimes if it doesn't seem correct, we toss it and rebuild it. But again, this is a very small cache, but when this happens, sometimes we see VC down events. You will see a red status in the admin UI in the dashboard, right, if this happens. But if you do see this happen, it's a lot of times it's credentials, right? Someone on the IT team updated the password for the service account, didn't tell us, right? That happens a lot. So make sure you're checking those things. Make sure you check the connectivity for the Virtual Center in the admin UI, that the password's right. Maybe just go update it anyway. A lot of times that will resolve those problems. Also, you can make sure the password's right just by logging in into the web client, right? Make sure that it hasn't changed. So again, looking at deleting. If you have a bunch of VMs on the broker that are in this deleting status, they've gotten hung, there's a number of things that can cause that. Sometimes we have links going down. Sometimes just stuff happens, right? We don't always know. We can get orphaned VMs. Sometimes Composer, gets a different idea of what's actually going on. We have, maybe it thinks the VM already exists, and so then it kind of freaks out and gets in a tizzy about it, if its database gets, out of whack. So when these things happen, we have some queries that we can go deal with this. We can actually clean up the Composer database. We can clean up those objects in the LDAP. It's not as scary as it may seem if you've never done it. We talked about split brain. If you do experience this issue, just want to point out that you'll see a ton of these rejoin and resync messages here at the bottom of the screen. These messages will be flooding. They'll be flooding your logs. So that's going to happen if you have a network segment on your WAN, that you split across, right? And then all of a sudden they're all trying to figure out what's happened. Why can't I talk to my other brokers? So they'll get unhappy about that. So if you see that spammed in your logs, that's time to talk to your network guy. So I promised you some queries to find some objects. If you're actually going to go into the LDAP and actually change some things, this is a good way to do it. If you need to find a particular VM with a snapshot, it looks kind of funny. LDAP syntax is not quite SQL, but it works. And finding a particular VM with a particular name is a very, very common one. So that bottom one is one you might use a lot. If you need to go find this particular VM, most people don't know the funny canonical names, those CN equal, huge GUID, right? We can't memorize that. So we need to look at the pretty name, and this is how we're going to do it. Name equals desktop, whatever your actual virtual machine would be called. So these are great queries if you've never used them. Of course, we have a KB that covers all this, but this is a nice handy reference if you want to print it out or something. Understanding the relationship between Active Directory, the LDAP that we have, as well as View Composer is important because they all work together. And so when we talk about cleaning up and trying to salvage a really broken broker environment, it's important to understand how these components all communicate with each other, right? When we actually create a desktop, we go create that object in Active Directory, right? We write several entries to our database of View Composer to keep track of that entry, as well as the UUID of the actual virtual machine in Virtual Center. and which replica is it pointing to, what data store is it using, maybe does it have a user data disk that's attached to it. We need to understand all those things. And then likewise, there's going to be an entry created into the ADLDS instance that's going to collate all this information into one entry that we reference from the view admin. So if things go wrong, right, we have a lot of virtual machines that are broken, missing, orphaned, zombied, whatever it may be, and we need to go clean up the environment. What do we have to remove? Well, we need to remove the composer database objects. First, we need to stop provisioning, though. We need to stop provisioning, keep any more data from being written to those databases. So we disable provisioning for that pool at the very least, maybe even altogether. Then we go remove those objects from the SQL database for Composer. Then we go remove the objects in Active Directory. This is commonly not done. Now, that's not as big of a deal these days because we can reuse computer objects, but I still recommend it. It's good to go just kind of end-to-end and clean things up. We also go use those queries we just talked about, find the actual entry. There's a couple places we do that. We do it in the server, the server's container where we have all the actual computer entries. Also applications sometimes will have some entries. We have some great KB articles. If you actually need to do this, I highly recommend you go read them. Also, then we'll need to actually remove the VM itself, right? But if you've ever had to do this before, you'll know that you can't just exactly go remove some of these VMs, because if it's tied to a replica, and if we need to remove that replica, we'll need to unprotect it. So this is a great operation. It's good to know in your tool chest, SVI config, unprotect. When we need to actually go unprotect the virtual machine for the replica so that we can delete it. If you try to go right-click and delete it, it's not going to work. Making sure you back up, of course, always back up everything before you do it. But if you do need to really just gut the thing and you don't want to reinstall, here's a query. Now, this actually got truncated at the bottom, and I will try to update this before we publish it. I don't know what happened there when I think when we switched to the widescreen format, but there is a query here. The top one is correct. If you need to delete just one virtual machine from Composer, this is what you would do. And of course, you would replace the replace me with the name of the computer, and you would execute all these actions in SQL, and then you're good. You're good to go from that aspect, right? Referencing the last slide, you do all those other things. You go delete here's the query you delete from Composer, and you're good to go. So this is a nice handy reference for if you need to clean things up, and it happens. So nice reference material. Again, I would grab the PDF of this. The last thing we're going to talk about is performance. Now, performance is, it's hit and miss, right? Typically these days, a lot of you are probably experiencing that the biggest performance indicator for VDI is storage, right? 4 years ago when I started this with you, everyone was just kind of getting started, it seemed like. And, we had, VDM 3.0. We all had, these big, nice, SANs that we had purchased for other things, and like, hey, let's try VDI. We put it on the spinning disks, and what did we find? Not very many IOPS, I'll tell you that much. A lot of latency. That was a common thing too, right? So now we're all, on the bandwagon of SSD, right? Our users demand iPad experience. That's what they want. That's what they're used to. So these problems are not as significant as they once were. Of course, memory, while it is expensive, in the grand scheme of things, we load our servers up now, right? We're doing, freaking terabyte of memory, it seems like. So it's not as hard to allocate a lot of memory to VMs anymore and really load down servers with a lot, high density of VMs. But if you are in a resource constrained, I have a lot of great slides in here, and I'm going to breeze through some of these because it's a lot of eye charts, and you don't want to try to read them. But the thing to know is that I have some good data in here on what to look for in terms of numbers. If things are not performing well, if your users call you and say, God, it's just I'm clicking and nothing's happening and I don't understand, there's a number of places we can go look, right? We go look at ESX Top. We can go look at maybe VC Operations Manager. I saw a number of great vendors here at VMworld with some really great products for monitoring. Clearly, there's a lot of people in the space that make some really cool stuff. It's important to have some tools available to you to actually look at this data. And when you look at this data, it's important to know, what are the numbers that I need to know? So, keeping some headroom is important. Making sure you're not stacking your hosts so much that there's no headroom for some expansion in CPU usage, right? People may run a YouTube video. People may run a high CPU-intensive application. We can put a lot of VMs on a host, but let's make sure we have a little bit of room to wiggle with, right? Making sure that storage latency, less than 25 milliseconds. Honestly, I would say even less than that. If you're getting at 25 milliseconds, people are going to feel it. It's going to, it's going to be noticeable. So one thing we talked about Flings. This is a tool that I've been involved in personally, and it's a great tool that's out there, also for free, called the VMware OS Optimization Tool. I like to put in a plug for it because it's still amazing how many people don't know about it. This is a tool that we developed here to basically implement some of our best practices when it comes to optimization for VDI. We have templates that are built in, for Windows 7, Windows 8, also for RDS hosts. Here's my warning to you, because I've been getting lots of feedback. People saying, I did it and it turned off Windows search service and it broke Outlook, and your mileage may vary. Understand that these are best practice guidelines and that you may or may not need all the optimizations that are in the templates. So understand that when you do this, test. Make sure you test. Use this on your base image. Do it and then install your applications and see what breaks. Do some QA of your own environment and ensure that your users are not going to run into applications before you deploy, pools of 5,000 VMs. But this tool, we have the OS optimization guide. Maybe many of you are familiar with that, with some scripts in the end. These are essentially those same scripts, but in a tool that you can easily implement as well as roll back, which is nice. You can just hit a button, it goes right back. As well as export. There's a little button down in the corner. You can export the results. So maybe you have a customer, if you're a partner, you do this out in the field, you can show that report to the customer and say, look, this is, according to VMware, this is where you're hitting the mark. And I don't have a screenshot of the report, but it's very nice looking. It incorporates a lot of these same elements. It's, it's nice and fancy and looks good to a customer when you need to prove to them that, hey, look, part of the problem on your performance may be that you haven't optimized your images. So go take a look at this tool. It's a really handy tool. Also, this is a script just for your reference. I wanted you to have it. If you need to capture performance data, we have a KB on this as well. But maybe something's happening at night when you're recomposing. You don't want to stay at the office all night and watch this. So you run a performance snapshot on the host, kick it off for 8 hours. The next day you can come in and you can replay this. You can actually look at the performance data in a replay, or even give it to our global support team and have them look at it and try to figure out what might be going wrong. So just a nice tool for your tool chest in terms of diagnosing issues after the fact. Now, I always plug this because I know that this is an internal tool and I really think it should be bundled with VDI. I've had a lot of people actually ask me that in our session yesterday. It's great. VC Operations Manager for View, we bake the agent right into the View agent. It's really, really handy, and not just being able to look at stuff after it happened, but being able to predict when things might happen in the future. And so I highly recommend having this or a third-party tool of some sort, but having something to be able to proactively manage your environment. That's where you really win as a troubleshooter, being able to identify it before it happens, right? That's the ideal thing that we all want. So I'm just going to blow through these real quick. I'm not even going to keep them up, but go grab them on the download. Just want to explain what they are, but I have several slides here with some screenshots from ESX Top and some numbers, like you don't want to have greater than, like for the disk, you don't want to have greater than 25 G average, things like that. So this is a good reference for yourself, just that, if you've never really worked with ESX Top before. So getting help. Double check your configuration, read the docs. I'm just as guilty as most of you probably. I love to just jump right in. Docs be damned, right? I'm not going to look at those, but we have a lot of great information on our website. We have a lot of great bloggers out there who love to write about our products. There's a lot of information out there that you can go get to understand how to troubleshoot, how to manage a View environment. I definitely recommend you go read up on it. There's Stefan Aslan, one of my colleagues, just released the Horizon View book. It's a great book. Talks about a lot of these things in there. So that's, the latest edition of that is out. Being able to understand how to generate a DCT with a support.bat, that is the tool that we actually generate these log bundles with. That's on every component of View. Knowing where that is, there's a great KB on how to go find that out. So in summary, just wrapping up here, you got to know where to look, right? We have a lot of components in play. We have, a lot of aspects and a lot of error messages. I can't give them all to you here today, but I'm hoping what you walk away with is the ability to understand where to look and how, once you find the information you need, how to filter it down into something meaningful that you can really use to solve the problem that's ahead of you. When a user calls in and says, my desktop is slow or I can't get to my desktop, having the information to know where to check and how to be able to really boil that down into a transaction of one connection flow through with the logs. Because keep in mind, we can take all these component logs, load them all together with these tools, and we can look at it end to end, right, with one view. So being able to do that is what will make you a great troubleshooter for VDI. So if you have any questions, I'm on Twitter. Feel free to snap my handle there, follow me, send me messages, let me know if this session is horrible and you fell asleep, or what we can add to it if it needs to be more technical. We do this year over year, and it's always pretty full, and everyone seems to get a lot out of it. So thank you again for coming. Please fill out the survey. Let us know, or tweet me, either one. But we'd love to, get your feedback. Thanks for coming out to VMworld, and I wish you the best of luck in troubleshooting. Thank you.